Chosen one, you awakened a frequency the elite feared most, the one they couldn't trace, decode, or suppress. The anointed ones, welcome. They mocked you before the tremor, as they always do before the quake. Before the storm hits, every prophet looks mad. Your dreams shook their false peace. Your warnings were dismissed as delusions. They called you unstable, psychotic, unhinged, because your frequency didn't match their programming. But guess what? That unstable vibration forecasted the very earthquake, now splitting their foundations. What they ridiculed yesterday, they're scrambling to understand today. Their systems were never designed to contain a soul like yours. You didn't just see the future, you became its signal. The same folks who used to murmur, "You need help," are now surreptitiously searching for information on how to reverse engineer your mind. The worst part is that, according to history, 7 out of 10 brilliant people were charged with insanity before their creations revolutionized society. So maybe you weren't insane. They were still stumbling over the bend, but you were barely ahead of it. To be honest, some of them claimed that you had an alien in your ear and a Wi-Fi router in your skull. However, you had downloads pouring in like lightning, and now everything is playing out just as you predicted. Hold on tight, because we're going to expose the reality that you were transmitting from the future and destroy the fiction that you were broken in this video. You may as well make it poetry if you're going to light up. So don't worry, we'll also have a little fun pulling the skeptics along. Let's begin. First of all, they chuckled as you were speaking from a world they had never been to. You were speaking a language they didn't understand, so they laughed. They had no relation to the things you were discussing. They found your statements strange, not because they were incorrect, but rather because they were based on a world their imaginations had never been into. You were only attempting to be truthful about what you understood deep down, not to be enigmatic. To preserve their sense of normalcy, however, they classify your truth as nonsense when it originates from a frequency they are unable to listen into. You were ahead. You weren't insane. You were deciphering energy, not talking incoherently. However, the people around you only believe what they can quantify, validate, or look up on Google. They were thus startled when you talked from intuition, dreams, symbolism, divine timing, or simply what you understood, since they were suddenly faced with a choice of either accepting that life is more complex than they were taught, or labeling you unstable. Furthermore, they chose the lazy path. Let's face it, your crazy talk was everything but. It included cutting-edge knowledge, spiritual downloads, and glimpses into the future. Simply said, most people are used to hearing viewpoints that have been repeated rather than unique, soul-level truth. Therefore, it seemed like a foreign accent to their weary perspective when you opened your lips and began speaking from that deeper well. Their lives, timelines, and headlines now include the exact things they ridiculed. The shift exposes energy shifts, breakdowns, and awakenings that you described are all happening right now. You don't appear that insane all of a sudden. You seem to have been tuned out while being plugged in. You talked out of alignment rather than ego. And now that they have the proof, they are seeing that you were in sync and not crazy. You just arrived ahead of them, and that's really why they couldn't deal with you. Because a person who can see scares the blind more than anything else. The second is that the selected are understood too soon, not misunderstood. They understood you just enough to make you uncomfortable, but not enough to misjudge you. They were deeply affected by what you said, something they didn't want to acknowledge existed. They weren't entirely unfamiliar with you. Actually, they were apprehensive because you were so near to their reality. You reflected what they were trying to avoid, like a mirror held too near. They made fun of you for that reason. For this reason, they rolled their eyes, disregarded your observations, and attempted to get you to doubt yourself. It was defense, not misunderstanding, since acknowledging that they understand you would require them to make a change. People like acting as if they don't understand you when in reality they do. They would need to mature, let go, or awaken. And when you're tied to comfort, development hurts. They felt uneasy because you were expressing the type of truth that called for action. Therefore, they attempted to drag you down with sarcasm and side eyes rather than getting up to meet you. You were just early. You weren't insane. It wasn't incorrect. Your thoughts, your viewpoints, your worldview. It was only a little early. The clock you were working on was a cosmic clock, a spiritual clock. You were downloading the next step while others were busy attempting to keep things as they were. However, you are labeled as exaggerated, theatrical, or insane when you speak from the future in a society that is fixated on the past. They were too restricted. You weren't too much. They labeled you because your presence made their box seem smaller, because acknowledging that you're being asked into something bigger is more difficult than shaming what you don't want to become. However, the events you mentioned are currently taking place directly in front of them. And that early comprehension that they previously turned into derision is now resurfacing as acknowledgement. The issue was never you. The preview was you. Finally, they are now seeing the film. Third, insanity is defined as the painful reality that is presented too soon. They branded you insane because your truth came out too soon, not because your ideas were nonsensical. In front of a group of individuals who were mired in the past, you were presenting information from the future. You were tuned in to a frequency they hadn't even found yet. So you weren't unstable. They found what you were saying strange not because it was incorrect, but rather because it made them face something their brains weren't prepared to handle. And individuals get anxious when they are unable to comprehend anything. They also label when they are in a panic. Before the world had the vocabulary to express them, you were revealing facts. Before they were apparent, you were seeing patterns. That is intelligence, not madness. We call that discernment. Long before the typical person could sense anything, your internal radar was detecting changes, motions, alerts, and discoveries. However, such type of inner wisdom is not rewarded by society. It is gaslighted by society. Because it allowed them to remain blind, they wanted to think you were broken. Because if you were correct, they would have to acknowledge that everything they held dear, trusted, or felt secure was in jeopardy. Their comfort was at danger because of your honesty. So they dubbed it a lie, as most people do when the truth is too loud. They referred to it as insane, or worse. However, truth is amusing because it doesn't care who believes it. It continues to develop. And now, you're experiencing the same things you were anticipating, warning about, and getting ready for. The individuals staring about in confusion are the same ones that ordered you to stop worrying, be quiet, or go seek assistance. They're having mental problems as they witness your alleged crazy talk develop in front of them. For the sake of excitement, you weren't ahead of your time. An alarm system was implanted within you from birth. And now that the smoke is rising and the alarm has gone out, people are beginning to see that what they first wrote off as insanity was really the reality in the early release. Fourth, they were afraid that you may be correct, not that you were wrong. They never really thought you were mistaken. They will never utter that bit aloud. They understood deep down that there was something about your insight that struck too close to heart, something about your comments that stabbed a bit too accurately. Confusion wasn't the problem. They knew you better than they acknowledged, and they worried for just that reason, because everything on which they relied was false, if what you were saying had any possibility of being true. The purpose of calling you insane was control, not argument or facts. It was their method of closing the door on a discussion that their souls weren't prepared to have. You weren't only expressing concepts, you were dispelling false impressions. Illusions are also cozy. People are protected in denial by illusions. You did more than just challenge their views. You struck a match close to their whole brain. They had to label you for that reason. You were too clear. Not because you were unintelligible. Your gut instincts, dreams, and intuition all revealed what they had been trying so hard to conceal. They weren't prepared to hear what you stated. You brought attention to the flaws in their relationships, the system, and themselves. People don't appreciate you when you shed that type of light. They assault you. Because when your whole existence is based on faking, clarity becomes dangerous. They had no worry that your ideas might fail. They were afraid your statements would be believed. They were afraid that one day they might wake up and see that you were correct. And that's precisely what's taking place right now. You've changed from being the odd one out, the overthinker, or the one who needs to relax. It is you whose alleged illusions have come to pass. Their current situation is the exact future they said would never materialize. In actuality, they aren't upset that you were mistaken. They're upset because they now have to acknowledge that you were consistently on time. Number 5. The throng becomes a mob when you're ahead of your time. Because you were unstable, you posed no danger. You saw too much too quickly, and that made you a target. The future you were speaking from had not yet come. People become defensive, uninterested, and closed off when they aren't prepared for that degree of awareness. People don't simply ignore you. They band together against you when enough of them feel threatened by things they don't comprehend. The audience turns into a riot at that point. Their timetable did not accommodate you. You were aware of patterns, changes in energy, and deeper realities that most people were still blind to since they were still preoccupied with superficial trends. They were uneasy because you were always one step ahead of them. You were not hallucinating. You were ahead of schedule. But early seems to be mistake to the untrained mind, and they decided to toss stones rather than inquire. Being awake in a room full of people who are all happily asleep is risky. They don't consider you to be perceptive when you arrive discussing topics that don't align with the state of affairs. You are seen as disruptive by them. Furthermore, individuals are more afraid of interruption than deceit. They didn't just disagree with you because of this. Because your vision let them realize how far behind they really were, they had to undermine you. They referred to your insight as fantasy. They referred to your downloads as drama. They referred to your clarity as pandemonium. However, the world is now slowly but surely catching up to what you were saying. You warned of a transformation, but it's no longer theory. It's manifesting itself in their daily lives. They're not sure whether they should apologize or pretend they never had any doubts about you. The idiot is not pursued by the crowd. The person who reveals their blindness is pursued by the crowd. You didn't make insane threats against them. The one thing they weren't prepared for, the arrival of truth before they could pretend to understand, was what you threatened to do. Sixth, your mind was rewired for higher frequencies, not damaged. They said there was a problem with your mind, but in reality, it was never damaged. It was just being adjusted to something bigger. You weren't programmed to fit in, do what you were told, or repeat the same old patterns that make most people complacent. You had keen ideas, not weird ones. They just weren't in line with the normal configuration of the system. Furthermore, everything that is different is seen as flawed in a society that is hooked to sameness. Most folks couldn't detect the info you were getting. They didn't even stop to look at the items you were questioning. It wasn't dysfunction. That was a disturbance from God. In real time, your system was rejecting falsehoods. They thought you were malfunctioning because you were unable to ingest what they had learned to digest. However, you weren't acting strangely. You were changing. What they were unable to interpret, they diagnosed. Because they were still operating on mental software created by fear, control, and survival, they saw your internal update as instability. Conversely, you were undergoing purposeful reprogramming. You weren't becoming disconnected from reality. Your ability to tolerate illusions was waning. Because of this, the things they held in high regard money, fame, and superficial conversations began to seem meaningless to you. Even if you didn't yet have the words for it, you could feel your brain expanding, changing, and yearning for something more profound. Naturally, they looked at you as if you were short-circuiting when you attempted to explain it. You were not short-circuiting, however. Truth was synchronizing with you. You were attempting to survive in a society that instructed you to sit down and be quiet while simultaneously improving your spiritual awareness, emotional intelligence, and observation. Fitting into the program is not why you came here. You came to send something new, rewrite it, and shatter it. The same ideas they labeled strange are now becoming knowledge. The improvements they made fun of are turning into plans. Your brain wasn't broken. It served as a model for the future of mankind. Seventh, you were deceived by a culture that is dependent on superficial reality. You were never erratic. You just refused to participate in the game. And it's enough to have you classified as broken in a culture that is hooked to superficial reality. They wanted you to worship appearances, nod at the headlines, pursue the titles, follow the script, and end your life. But you were able to see through it. You saw the hiccups, the trends, the emotionlessness in people's eyes, and how everything seemed staged, scripted, and unauthentic. And they freaked out when you didn't pretend. You weren't acting strangely. The simulation was being interrupted by you. Don't question too much. Don't feel too deeply. Don't wake up. Is an unwritten rule that you disobeyed, but you did it. You awoke. You began asking queries to which they had no responses. You were aware of the illusion, began to peel back the curtain, and most importantly, you ceased to support it. They were uneasy because of it. Not your actions, not your ideas, but your defiance of their interpretation of reality. The Matrix's favorite tactic is gaslighting, because the system will be unable to endure if people begin to understand fully. It must thus cause you to question yourself. It must persuade you that your emotional intelligence is instability, your enlightenment is insanity, and your clarity is chaos. You were too genuine for a world still locked in a costume party, despite their claims that you were too much, too sensitive, and too passionate. The simulation's fractures are becoming visible. The system that labeled you unstable is beginning to disintegrate. The falsehoods are more audible. The diversion isn't effective. People are beginning to realize how phony the things they formerly trusted are. And all of a sudden, the qualities you were condemned for, your intuition, your foresight, and your reluctance to fit in, appear to be survival abilities. The Matrix wasn't the only thing you were seeing. It was never intended for you to be stuck in it. Furthermore, you are not the malfunction when it falls. Indeed, they are. The architect they attempted to remove is you. And now that the illusion is dissolving, everyone's attention is focused on you, the one who saw it all at first. Eighth, they classified you as hazardous because you caused them to experience cognitive dissonance. You never used physical force to threaten someone. You used the facts to frighten them. And that's even more hazardous in a society where falsehoods are a source of protection. You were entering rooms with a different energy, a greater understanding, and a viewpoint that wasn't in line with the script, rather than with aggressiveness. And when your remarks conflicted with their training, they reacted with terror rather than interest. Their belief systems, their brittle sense of identity, and their desire for certainty were all sparked by you, and they were unaware that it was there. There was no need for you to attempt. The base they stood on was shaken just by your sincerity. And people don't ask for your blueprint when their inner world begins to fall apart. They go to defensive mode. At that point, people start using labels like unstable, too intense, and negative. Denial was difficult because of you, not because you were any of those things. When cognitive dissonance strikes, it may be violent. Instead, then reconsidering their reality, people will rather condemn the messenger. It's simpler to think you're mistaken than to acknowledge that their whole perspective is too limited. They undercut your credibility then. They doubted you were sane, not because you posed a physical threat to them, but rather because you endangered their comfort. They attempted to isolate you. They weren't being destroyed by you. You were making them change. Not everyone is prepared for it either.